Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It is Justin Johnson, and we're on a module Confidence in Crisis, to 1880, edited by Don Na Loftus. It's block 2, A225. The aims of this unit explain how and why the mid 19th century is associated with equipoise and optimism. Consider historical debates of this. Introduce the topics of Block 2. In the introduction, the age of equipoise and the Great Exhibition of 1851. Throughout this introduction, we welcome Block 2, Confidence and Crisis, 1840 to 1880. Block 2 covers the mid-19th century, a period still associated with the sort of anxieties you studied in Block 1, but also with increasing confidence that industrialisation would help make the everyday lives of working people better. Better way of introduction to Block 2. This unit will demonstrate how confidence and crisis coexisted in the mid-19th century. Unit begins in the 1840s, one of the most turbulent decades in the history of the British Isle, and one that has since become known as the Hungry Forties. The decade witnessed the Irish famine, explored in detail in the unit Ireland and the famine. Unit 9, and one of the deepest economic depressions of the 19th century, which caused mass starvation, unemployment and unrest across the United Kingdom. There were widespread fears that industrialisation had come to an end and great anxieties about future progress. In the middle of such uncertainty, there was considerable controversy about how to deal with this present crisis. Thinkers and politicians, writers and artists debated who was responsible for aggravating distress. Some argued that the state should do more, others that the laissez-faire political economy ruled out government interference should be allowed to run its course. In context, radicalism flourished. The Chartist movement that you have encountered in the unit of the Rise of the Working Class, Unit 3 and Block 1, reached its peak in the 1840s. As revolutions broke out across Europe in 1848, the stability of the nation appeared to be under threat. In section 8.1 and 8.2, you will respectively consider the rise of radicalism through the Chartist movement and the Anti-Corn Law League, and a question how Britain managed to avoid revolution in 1848 when so many other countries did not. Just 3 years after Year of Revolutions, the great exhibition of the works of industries of all nations was held in the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, London. This was a major international event showcasing manufactured items from the United Kingdom and the rest of the world. Historians have interpreted the event as evidence of renewed confidence in industrialisation and its ability to deliver progress and prosperity to the people of the United Kingdom. Purbrick 2001. Such confidence was, it would seem, demonstrated in the support of the Great Exhibition among a large portion of the population. Over 6 million visits were made to the exhibition, and it was considered a great success at the time and subsequently. In a case study of the Great Exhibition in section 8.3, you'll look at how such confidence in progress was fostered and how consensus between different social and political groups was cultivated. You will also examine how deep this confidence was, where the anxieties and uncertainties of the early 19th century still apparent under the pomp and ceremony of the Great Exhibition. Section 8.4 will go on to explore the social and political reforms for the mid-century and and whether other material factors such as improvements in the standards of living shaped a new confidence in the future, then in preparation for the rest of Block 2. You'll briefly consider the tensions that lay behind any social and political consensus and how these emerged in the 1860s and 1870s. As you work through this unit, you'll be asked to think about how the turbulence of the 1840s gave way to the increasing confidence in a modern industrial society, and whether there is anything in the claim that the mid-century was an age of equipoise. Equipus. This term was first used in historian William Burn in 1967 to describe the period between 1852 and 1867. I want to highlight that word as one of stability, claim, and optimism, in contrast to the unrest and anxiety of the years before and after. Burn did not claim that there were no disputes in this period. In fact, he noted that there were many. However, the mid-Victorian generation was confident that such disputes could be resolved through compromise and that competing interests in politics, economy, and society could be held in balance. As Burn said, what he found in studying the mid-century was a generation in which the old and the new, the elements of growth, survival, and decay, achieved a balance which most contemporaries regard as satisfactory. The phrase of age of Equipus caught the imagination of subsequent historians because it appeared to explain why there was greater optimism about progress in the mid-century, as you'll see throughout Block 2. Many of the fears of early 19th century society were not realised after 1848. Working class radicalism dissipated and Chartism declined. The middle class was on the rise. Growing in political influence after the Reform Act of 1832 and the Municipal Corporations Act of 1835. But the landed aristocracy had not been overthrown and peaceful class coexistence looked possible. There were real improvements in everyday life for a number of people as the social reforms of the early period began to have an impact. As the units making of the British class and cities, disease and health units 12 and 13 explain, the new middle class established a power base in industrial towns and cities through civic councils and voluntary associations, and held to build roads and sewers as well as churches, town halls, libraries and schools. The Factory Acts have been passed to limit the working hours of women and children employed in factories, and slavery had been abolished. But global trade was flourishing. As a result, there was increasing faith in beneficial influence of free trade, greater confidence and a minimal state would represent the interest of all the people and confidence that political economy could be humanized. It became possible, as a great exhibition demonstrates, to think of the United Kingdom as a progressive liberal society made up of different people, groups and forces, each playing a role in contributing to the well-being of the whole. But such as a vision was fragile and was by 1860s coming under strain. Depressions in trade reoccurred throughout the mid-century, puncturing prosperity and eroding confidence in a lasting stability, as you'll see in Unit 9. The Irish famine was over by the 1850s, but its effects lingered in debates over Home Rule and Irish independence. The unit Work, Poverty and the New Poor Law, Unit 10, will show how continued poor law raised questions about inequalities in wealth and whether more needed to be done to keep working people out of poverty. The unit Religion, Revival and Reform, Unit 11, will look at how the idea of the United Kingdom as a peaceful and tolerant was challenged by religious tensions, some of which become violent. Similarly, as you will discover in the unit Britain and Empire, 1839 to 1886, global trade and empire, far from delivering peace and tranquility, drew Britain into a number of wars and conflicts as the century progressed. By the late 1860s and the 1870s, equipoise was a decline and optimism in short reply. Writers who were critical of industrialisation, such as Karl Marx (1818 to 1838), were coming to prominence, and as Unit Politics and the People, Unit 14 explains, working men stepped up their campaign for the vote. The conclusion to this unit will revisit how these issues will be taken up in the rest of Block 2. 8.1 Chartism and the Anti-Corn Law League in the 1840s. In the 1840s, many of the social, political, and economic problems that had emerged in the early 19th century got progressively worse. The sense of a crisis building was fostered by three trends. First, in the aftermath of the Depression from 1837 to 1843, greater publicity was given to the plight of the poor. In the 1830s, statistical evidence about the impact and extent of poverty was generated by investigators such as James K. Shuttleworth, 1804 to 1877, and circulated in learned societies. In the 1840s, the impact of poverty reached the public through the voices of poor themselves in popular newspapers such as Morning Chronicle. The investigative journalist Henry Mayhew, 1812 to 1887, describes the lives of the poor, in their own words, giving particular scope to these displaced by modernisation. From the starving navvies employed to build railways, roads and bridges, to be improvised weavers of Lancashire replaced by factories and machines, and to the seated labourers of London's East End garment and furniture trades. Empathy for the poor was cultivated by sketches and illustrated papers, and poems and fiction dramatised the personal struggle to survive. A poem by Thomas Hood, 1799 to 1845, Song of the Shirt, which describes a seamstress working herself to death, was reproduced in many newspapers in 1843. Boyce, 2012. Second resentment about the unfair impact of industrialisation of the working classes was sharpened by hatred of the Corn Laws, which dated from 1815, and the New Poor Law of 1834, which together fuelled claims made by radicals, and the British government was corrupt, self-interested intent in protecting the landed elites and the expense of ordinary working people. Third, the investment bubble generated by the expansion of railways in the 1840s was brought to a sudden end of the crash of 1847. In the commercial crisis that followed, business collapsed, including a number of provincial saving banks, and many people, including ordinary people, working and middle-class savers, lost a lot of money. Together, these events fueled fears that industrialisation had come to an end, and many critics argued that the dominating ideology. On page 10, of the day, laissez-faire political economy was producing nothing more than poverty and disorder. The uncertainties and crises of the 1840s fueled radical politics and provided the basis of two reform movements, Chartism and Anti-Corn Law League. Both movements coexisted for around 10 years until the Corn Laws were replaced in 1846. The Chartist movement and the Anti-Corn Law League kept the plight of the working class family at the forefront of political debate in the 1840s. On the surface, their solutions looked very different. The extension of the franchise to all adult men and the repeal of the Corn Laws, but there were also grounds for agreement. Understanding equipoise in the mid-century requires an examination of Chartism aims and its relationships with the Anti-Corn Law League. Chartism. As you know from Unit 3, the Chartist movement was formed in the late 1830s after disappointment with the Reform Act of 1832. Its primary focus on parliamentary reform, the 6 points that you studied in this unit, bliss was it that adorned to be alive. Unit 1, in Block 1, enabled to draw together men and women from a range of backgrounds, from artisans in well-paid trades to agriculture labourers and factory workers. However, for many Chartists, the vote was a means to an end, a fairer society for working people. Chartism was a national movement organised through local committees and was particularly strong in London, Wales, and the manufacturing districts of the North England and the Midlands. It had a rich and vibrant culture. It made great use of the press. The Chartist newspaper, the Northern Star, was published between 1837 and 1852. And its used memorabilia merchandise. Fairs and tea parties to inspire loyalty, attract members and raise money. Women were an integral part of Chartism. They rarely gave speeches, but they were active in the movement and present of marches and rallies. Turn to page 8.1, the first Chartism petition, 1839, located at the end of the unit. After you have read this, answer the following questions. Why do the Chartists blame for their present distress, and who do they not blame? What do the Chartists ask for and why? What do they threaten if they don't get it? The specimen answer, the Chartists blame the rulers for their distress. They don't blame God, providence or nature. They argue that the land itself is goodly, the soil rich. They also don't blame the manufacturers. They note that merchants and manufacturers are enterprising and skillful, and the workers and are industrious. All the conditions are right for prosperity, but excessive taxation has led to bankruptcy for the capitalists and a starvation for workers. The Chartists ask for adult male suffrage on the principle that they are freemen. With the vote, they can challenge corruption and ensure policies that work in the interests of ordinary people rather than the wealthy. They don't directly threaten, but they hint that without social, economic and political changes, the stability of the throne and the peace of the kingdom are endangered. There has been extensive debate among historians about whether or not Chartists identified with each other as members of the working class, united in opposition to the other social groups such as manufacturers and the landed elite. Reading 8.1 shows how complicated this question is. In the extract, Chartists define themselves as freemen, and as part of the state, you can see that this is when they say they are required to support and obey the laws. There is little reference to the Chartists as a group of workers, although there is evidence that they are concerned as workers to ensure that taxes are reduced and food and products are made affordable. Instead, they think that property should bear the burden of taxation. However, they also share some interest with their masters. They assume that healthy trade is good for all and argue that masters must be allowed to keep their capital. They avoid class language, but they do talk of the people, as you saw in Unit 3. This sort of language enabled Chartists to include a vast range of people in the movement. The Anti-Corn Law League. The Anti-Corn Law League was formed in January 1839 in Manchester by members of the manufacturing middle class who had campaigned successfully for political reform in 1832. Like the Chartists, they were responding to the depression of the late 1830s. They argued that the abolishing the corn laws would receive industrial by bringing cheap corn into the country, leaving worker families with more money to spend on other things. They also thought free trade agreements would create a market for British manufactured goods abroad. As one of their members, the businessman and MP of Bolton, Dr. John Bowring, 1792 to 1872, put in a speech in 1838 on the need for a national association. When I went to Brittany and Normandy, what said the Normans and Bretons? We are millions, they said, willing to clothe ourselves in garments you send us, and you have millions of hungry mouths to take our corn. Quoted in Prentice, 1853, page 65. For many in the movement, repeal of the Corn Laws was part of the wider vision that saw free trade as a basis for prosperity and peace. Like the Chartists, the Anti-Corn Law League was formed of local association that constituted a national body. It raised money through membership subscriptions, baziers, and a scale of souvenirs and memorabilia. It had its own press and used newspapers and pamphlets carried through the post to keep members informed of meetings and rallies. The Economist magazine, established to help further interest of the Anti-Corn Law League, become an outspoken supporter of free trade policies. The Anti-Corn Law League was well resourced financially and politically. Members paid a subscription, which funded campaigns and which helped get Anti-Corn Law League candidates elected to Parliament. Richard Cobden, 1804 to 1865, and John Bright, 1811 to 1889. Both cotton manufacturers become the most outspoken members of the League in the House of Commons. Turning to reading 8.2, Resolutions of the Anti-Corn Law League, 1853, located at the end of the unit. These resolutions were agreed at the meeting of the Anti-Corn Law League in Manchester in 1839 and published in Archibald Prentice in the History of the League of 1853. After you have read this, the following questions. Considering Resolution 3, how do the members of the Anti-Corn Law League define their interest? As are they separate from the rest of the people? Look again at Resolution 4. Do you notice any similarities in the argument and language in the Chartist petition? Anti-Corn Law League members see their interest as the same as those productive members of society. The repeal of both corn laws would prove a stimulus to trade, which would benefit both capitalists and labourers in agriculture and industry. Like the Chartists, the Anti-Corn Law League members argue that there is nothing natural about the present distress. Instead, they argue that men are hungry in the midst of boundless fields of employment because of the government legislation and taxation. And like the Chartists, they also refer to the people and the nation. The Chartist movement and the Anti-Corn Law League were mass movements organised through local associations, Vernon 2014. This enabled them to accommodate members from different parts of the British Isle with different kinds of interests and agendas. They each also had a clearly stated aim. A charter and repeal that was used to argue for a broader set of demands. They both use similar language and motives in their literature and articles of association. Both the Anti-Corn Law League and the Chartists refer to shared interests between manufacturers and workers, employers and employees. Both were optimistic that the energy and enterprise of manufacturers, merchants and workers would lead to prosperity if unhindered by taxes and government interference to protect landowners. They both talked about the people and the nation, which suggests they imagine a community that shared basic values, one that cuts across class differences. They both believed in order, but warned that this could be threatened if deprivation continued. Exercise 8.1 and 8.2 have demonstrated the strong connections between the interests pursued by the Anti-Corn Law League and the Chartist movement. Historians such as Patrick Joyce have argued that the shared interest of the Chartists and free traders developed into a broad-based popular liberalism in the 1850s and 1860s, which in turn provided the foundations of the mid-Victorian consensus, Joyce, 1991. By talking of the people and the nation, these movements cut through class interests. They presented workers and manufacturers. We're going to keep it there. Thank you for listening, agents.